I'll be honest, if Cece had a face like that, I'd probably shave her ass and teach her to walk backwards. Now, beauty is only scale deep and subjective, which is lucky for this guy because when it has a face like that and a reputation for infuriating arc players, poor Pegomastax does not have a lot going for it. But this dinosaur did have some interesting innovations, so let's get into it. Despite being a relatively recent description, material of this dinosaur only a mother could love was found all the way back in the late 60s from the Elliott Formation of South Africa, when excavations turned up a partial skull. It was thought that this specimen represented a new taxon, but these were not named right up until 2012 when Paul Sereno named it Pegomastax africanus, meaning the African strongjaw. Now, neither remains have turned up since, so how do we know just how ugly this thing was? Well, Pegomastax has been found to have been a heterodontosaurid, specifically one very closely related to the main man himself, Heterodontosaurus, a dinosaur that in terms of its skeleton we know pretty much everything. Using phylogenetic bracketing, paleontologists surmise that this ornithopod likely looked very similar in terms of overall body plan to Heterodontosaurus, albeit a bit smaller. The skull of Pegomastax looks to be roughly 64% smaller, so it's likely that this lookalike to a parrot licking dog crap off of a stinging nettle was around 76 centimeters or 2.5 feet long and approximately 1.7 kilograms or 3.7 pounds in weight. Now, ornithopods seem to have a trend of being obligatory bipedal at smaller sizes and transitioning to a quadrupedal gait as they evolve bigger, and this little guy is no exception, running around on 2 relatively long legs and sporting forelimbs only slightly shorter with 5 possibly visible fingers, though probably only 3 of them were actually clawed. The tail would have been much longer when compared to most theropods in proportion to the body, and with regards to integument, well, we have to look a little further afield at its other relative, Tianyu long from the J-hole biota, which shows an integument similar to that of Psittacosaurus, in that it was scaly with filaments running down its back, similar to a porcupine, but probably not used defensively. We'll get into why in a minute. Now, I keep comparing it to Heterodontosaurus, and that's because it's really not fair that I keep calling this little guy out for being the only ugly one. This whole family was pretty ugly. In fact, there's a famous reconstruction that's done its rounds in certain years that I could have sworn was Pegomastax, but turns out the picture I was looking for was Heterodontosaurus. Oops. Look, give me a break, you're getting 2 dinosaurs for the price of 1 here. So, what made these faces unique? Well, it all starts with the dentition. For the Latin lovers among you, you might have already figured out that Heterodontosaur actually means different toothed reptile. These were small bipedal ornithischian dinosaurs that didn't get bigger than a fox, found on all continents except Australia and Antarctica, and spanned the early Jurassic right up to the early Cretaceous. The namesake comes from the fact that these dinosaurs not only had some typical leaf-shaped herbivore teeth along with a beak, but also what can only be described as tusks for canines, ones that were especially straight in Pegomastax when compared to other heterodontosaurids. But why? Well, you're going to have to wait for that because we do things a certain way around here and my therapist says that I need structure in my life. So after the description, as always, we'll follow the dinosaur's environment. Pegomastax was found in the Upper Elliott Formation of the South African Karoo Basin, a formation that spans the Triassic-Jurassic boundary between 201.3 to 190.8 million years ago. This area is actually the oldest dinosaur-dominated biozone in all of Gondwana, showing many ornithischian and sauropodomorph dinosaurs that were among the first to adapt the lightly built lifestyle in the southern hemisphere. South Africa at the time wasn't landlocked, but was pretty close to it, since the southern tip of South America and Antarctica was hugging it nicely, forming a strait through which the Panthalassic Ocean was just about poking through. As the sea levels dropped, however, this region became more arid through this transition of the Triassic into the Jurassic, with the meandering rivers and lakes becoming fewer and far between, and floodplains going longer as just being, well, plains, with only the odd flash flood. Occupying this region were a few basal crocodilomorphs, like Lacerda and Sphenosuchus, some small basal mammals like Megazostrodon and Eleotherium, And the dino list from this formation include a couple of theropods such as Dracovinator and Megapnosaurus, a huge number of small to medium sauropodomorphs like Aeodonyx, Lidumahadi, Melanorosaurus, Antitonitrus, and a high percentage of Massospondylus. Other ornithischians alongside Pegomastax include Lesothosaurus, Abrictosaurus, Heterodontosaurus, and Eocursor. Now this environment is potentially important when trying to figure out what these teeth were actually for. Living in a really dry, arid environment is really not ideal for a herbivore because Biology 101, plants like water and that. The vegetation here was likely pretty hard-wearing and either somewhat riparian or got by just about on the floodplains, such as horsetails, bennettitails, and seed ferns, which brings us neatly back into what this guy ate. These tusks in particular have been interpreted in a few ways. The first of these is that Heterodontosaurids were simply omnivorous, using those tusks to kill and tear apart some smaller animals on occasion. The second is that this was actually a form of sexual dimorphism and they were used for display and intraspecific combat and general defense. And then the third is that these were highly specialized herbivory tools, used to eat plants that not many other herbivores wasted their energy trying to eat. Now, occasional omnivory is never actually off the cards for any herbivore, believe it or not, but I don't think that that's what these were specifically evolved for. The shape and lack of microwear on these tusks on Pegomastax specifically show that these were most similar to the tusks of peccaries, which used them to dig out various seeds, nuts, thistles and roots. Now of course these foods specifically weren't around at the time, but there would have been plant matter similar enough in terms of form, texture and placement that Pegomastax could have used those function over form teeth to find. This also makes sense when we think about the fact that these plants inhabited areas where there was a relatively low amount of surface water, so having deeper roots to find water further within the soil would be critical, and digging those out to feed on would need some specialist tools. That's the theory I subscribe to anyway, but what do you think? Have a think about what you'd like to comment about this beautiful on the inside dinosaur whilst I answer this week's question, which comes from Lace of Heaven 1017. Who's asked, "Hi Dino-gen, I've never had an answer to this. How can exothermic fish live energetic, active lives in cold waters, in temperatures that would quickly kill exothermic reptiles, or us mammals for that matter? Think of North Pacific salmon powering up waterfalls in the Canadian coastal rivers. Even Galapagos iguanas that dive into cold Pacific waters to eat have to get out of the water quickly before they become torpid and die. Why have no land-based exotherms been able to adapt to cold temperatures like fish have?" First up, I'm going to be that guy. You wrote exothermic, meaning exterior thermoregulation, i.e. cold-bloodedness. But the term we use is ectothermic. It does make you stupid. This is just nitpicking coming from a guy who once called his girlfriend's mum erogenous rather than erroneous. Anyway, it's a brilliant question, and it's one that I don't really think is addressed all that much. So yeah, you're totally right. Okay, so how are fish exothermic or cold-blooded when 1, they live very active lifestyles seen more in endothermic animals such as mammals or birds, and 2, how do they even survive? Because they not only live in regions not suitable for animals like reptiles, but also in a medium that is famously good at sapping away heat and can exacerbate cold conditions. Okay, I'm going to digress a little bit into warm-bloodedness just so we can define the terms endothermic and ectothermic. Endothermic animals like mammals and birds produce their own body heat. Now, a common misconception is that this is a positive feedback loop cycle. In other words, body heat is produced by high activity, which then helps along high productivity, and this is simply not the case. Now, body heat produced by being physical is a thing because thermodynamics are a thing that have been known for years. But the amount of heat that this actually produces is negligible enough for it to not heat the entire body consistently. On the other hand, high-level activity is not fueled by heat, it's fueled by calories, which means that heat produced alone doesn't make an animal all hyper. In fact, the whole process of endothermy is very expensive in terms of fuel, i.e. calories, so a more active lifestyle is needed just to find more fuel. Exothermic tetrapods don't move around a lot because their bodies are not as demanding, not because they don't have the energy. So they can afford to lay about in the sun most of the time. Simply put, they don't move around as much because their biological needs don't need as much fuel, so why bother? So high activity does not produce most of the heat seen in endothermic animals, but it can help push things along a little bit. This does mean, though, that high activity does not necessarily equate to endothermy. Instead, high activity lifestyles are an effective endothermy because endothermy is such a calorically expensive process. So high activity is needed to fuel it. But fish are doing what they're doing, so just bear in mind that calories, not heat specifically, are needed for high activity lifestyles. But that still begs the question, how do they do what they do in cold water? Well, you do actually get the odd warm-blooded fish like tuna or sharks, but cold-blooded fish can do what they do for a number of reasons. Firstly, even though water can feel cold to us, water is actually a lot more stable in terms of temperature than open air is. The reason that humans, or most mammals not specialised for swimming, feel the cold is because water on fur heavily negates its insulating effects, and it takes a lot longer to dry, so it's sapping away heat for longer, along with the fact that even though we can produce our own heat, our bodies are insanely fussy with what internal temperature it wants to maintain. It's so sensitive that even minor changes can have drastic or even lethal effects, whereas fish are a little bit more hardy to temperature changes internally. They have enzymes that can operate at cooler temperatures, meaning that their metabolism can operate more slowly but still optimally at lower temperatures and help the muscles continue doing what they're doing. They also often hibernate during colder seasons at the bottom below the sediment where more heat is retained, and they even produce their own antifreeze proteins to stop ice crystals forming. So TLDW, it's not like they have any special ways to counteract the cold specifically. They just don't care and aren't little pussies like us. Having said that, there are still a lot of fish that avoid the cold just because they can't handle it, so it's not the same across the board. Anyway, I hope this answers your question. Thank you for submitting it, and thank you to everyone else for watching this video all the way to the end. Anyway, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already, and I will catch you guys next time.